Okay, well, welcome back to this session. Our focus now is shifting from law to a kind of broad package of economics, accounting, politics, and also returning to issues of sustainability. We've got a limited amount of time. We want to maximise that for the speakers, but also for your own contributions. So I'm going to ask the speakers to briefly introduce themselves as we go through, and I am going to be very, very tough on timing. So I would ask the speakers to limit themselves to 10 minutes maximum, and I will intervene and stop them at that point, because I think we need as much time as possible for broader discussion. Our first attempt, anyway, for the first speaker is from Joey Davis, who's coming on a video. So we're just going to see whether we can get some sound up to work for that, and then we will have some live presentations, or if this doesn't work, we may have it towards the end, or we may just simply have to abandon it. Okay.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel today on managing for shareholder value. I'm very excited to be here, even if only virtually, and look forward to Skyping in for the panel discussion. I wanted to talk about what's wrong with shareholder value. I wanted to start by describing what exactly is shareholder value, and there's two versions of this. In theory, shareholder value is the value delivered to shareholders because of management's ability to grow earnings, dividends, and share price. In other words, shareholder value is the sum of all strategic decisions that affect the firm's ability to efficiently increase the amount of free cash flow over time. That's the conceptual definition of shareholder value. In practice, shareholder value really means market capitalization. That is the total value of the company's shares on the stock market. Unlike in theory, a company's share price is easy to know every second of every day. So practically speaking, share price ends up being the meaning of shareholder value. So why do companies pursue shareholder value? So corporations with shares traded on stock markets face a set of interlocking pressures to focus on share price. One is boards of directors. Second is that their compensation is typically tied to share price. The executives often get stock options to orient them towards share price. Financial analysts demand it. Activist investors demand shareholder attention to share price. And if these things fail, there's the market for corporate control. That is, if the company's stock price drops low enough, it's often possible for outsiders to buy control of the company and take it over. Note that all of these things put together add up to a system of corporate governance. Now, pervasive financial media, widespread public stock ownership, and the simplicity of a single measure of performance give share price unique power. Practically speaking, share price is what the investing public cares about. This is what performance means. It's not the conceptual definition of shareholder value. It's share price. How much is in my pension fund or my mutual fund right now? There is actually a moral case for pursuing shareholder value. I'm going to give you this in the form of a syllogism with a couple of Nobel Prize winners along the way. This is, why is society better off if companies pursue shareholder value? Milton Friedman's argued that firms maximize social welfare by maximizing profits. Eugene Fama has argued that share price is the best indicator of sustainable profitability. That's the efficient market hypothesis. Both of these fellows together are Nobel Prize winners in economics, so they must be right. The implication of all of this is that firms maximize social welfare by maximizing share price. As the economists say, QED. Now, not everybody is persuaded by this syllogism, but that's certainly a story that's out there in the land. So how does shareholder value influence corporate strategy? Orientation towards share price leads companies to adopt strategies and structures that are valued by financial markets. Companies do the things that Wall Street approves of, and they don't do the things that Wall Street doesn't approve of. So some market-approved strategies include pervasive outsourcing. I call this Nikeification. As you probably know, Nike designs and markets its sneakers from Oregon, but the production is done by high-volume producers in East Asia rather than the company itself. Employment minimization. You don't get paid for creating jobs, you get shareholder value for creating free cash flow. Domain shopping for tax havens. And stock buybacks. This is something that Bill Lazonick on the panel has written about quite eloquently. I would argue that widespread orientation toward share price, as in the United States, creates pathologies for the wider economy. I want to give the specific example of creating employment. The biggest problem in the American economy today is creating jobs, and one of the prescriptions that's been offered is we want to make it easier for companies to go public, list their shares on the stock market, and that will help. And I want to give a counterexample of that. It's a case study of a company called Sara Lee. So Sara Lee in 1996 was number 50 on the Fortune 500 list of the largest American corporations. It was based in Chicago, and it was a consumer powerhouse. Its brands included Hanes, Coach, Champion, Wonder Bra, Jimmy Dean, Ballpark Franks, Dow Egberts Tobacco and Coffee, and dozens of others. It was a consumer brand powerhouse, a very well-regarded employer, known for having very effective programs for promoting women into management. So in the Chicago area in particular, it was beloved by MBA students that I taught at that time. So in the mid-1990s, Sara Lee was pressured by Wall Street to try to unlock shareholder value. What that usually means is sell things off and split things up. And that's what they did. They adopted a new mission statement. It said Sara Lee Corporation's mission is to build leadership brands in consumer packaged goods markets around the world, but our primary purpose, the reason we exist, is to create long-term stockholder value. What did that mean in practice? It meant restructuring to become more like Nike, using contractors to produce its main products with predictable results for employment. So why did they do that? What did that have to do with shareholder value? The CEO at the time, John Bryan, said, Wall Street can wipe you out. They're the rule setters. They do have their fads, but to a large extent there's an evolution in how they judge companies, and they have decided to give premiums to companies that harbor the most profits for the least assets. In other words, if you want to increase your return on assets, you can either increase the returns, that is, your profits, or you can reduce the assets, that is, getting rid of physical factories and things like that. And that was the path that Sara Lee took in their de-verticalization program. Fast forward 15 years later to 2012, and after 15 years of shareholder-oriented restructurings and spin-offs, what was left of Sara Lee was split into two companies, Hilscher Brands in the US and Dow Egberts Master Blenders in Europe. I want to show you the employment consequences of Sara Lee's pursuit of shareholder value. Through the 1990s, Sara Lee had about 150,000 employees around the world. After their embrace of shareholder value and relentlessly restructurings, they end up now with about 10,000 employees. It's not just Sara Lee where this story is true, that shareholder value is detached from other social goods like creating employment. So consider this comparison. Kroger is a grocery store in the U.S. It has revenues in 2012 of about $100 billion. It had 343,000 employees. In fact, it's the fourth largest employer in the U.S., primarily with unionized jobs with pretty good benefits. Net income in 2012 was $1.5 billion, which strikes me as respectable. And their market capitalization, the value of all of the company's shares on the stock market, $20 billion. Now let's take Twitter. Its revenues that same year, 1/3 of $1 billion, about 1/300th of what Kroger had. Employees today is about 2,300, very tiny company. Its net income, well, it hasn't actually made a profit yet, and it might be a while before it does. That year, it had a loss of about $80 million. And how much is its market capitalization? $33 billion. it is more than 50% larger in market capitalization than Kroger. I'd ask you the somewhat rhetorical question, which company has created more value? The large employer with a lot of revenues or Twitter? I want to point out that this has been a very American-centric talk so far, so think of it as a cautionary tale. In fact, economies vary enormously in how common shareholder-owned corporations are. If you look at this chart, you'll see that across Europe, there are many countries that have relatively few publicly traded corporations. On the far right, you see the U.S. with a whole lot of public corporations in 2008, on the verge of the crisis. But then you have countries, and Romania, which also has a surprisingly large number of public corporations. Then you see countries like Germany. Now, Germany has about the same number of publicly listed companies as Pakistan. That seems surprising, but it does suggest that you don't need to have publicly traded corporations for economic vitality. They don't have to be the main way that you organize the economy. If you do choose to organize the economy around shareholder value, then you're going to be more prone to crises. This is a diagram showing the S&P 500, a broad stock market gauge in the U.S. from January 2000 to today. And what you'll see is repeated rounds of bubbles and collapses. Things went well last year for investors. The last week's been a little bit dicier, but this is not a prescription for endless growth from what we can tell. I want to end with three conclusions for this conference. The first one is that public policy shapes the goals, strategies, and structures pursued by corporations. As Lynn Stout will be pointing out, and as she's described in her book, it's not the case that the law forces corporations to pay attention to shareholder value. There really is a public policy choice around what the goals and strategies and structures will be for corporations. So that's a matter of choice, not something that's just already given by law. Second, I think the evidence suggests that policies that encourage shareholder value will not address the most pressing economic problems such as employment growth. I've looked at every company that's gone public in the U.S. since the turn of the millennium. Add them all up, and their job growth is less than the U.S. lost in March 2009 alone. Companies going public just don't create very many jobs in the scheme of things. So if you hope that by encouraging entrepreneurs to go public, you're going to create employment, that's a mirage. That's not really going to happen. Finally, shareholder value orientation introduces tendencies towards bubbles and crises. This is something we've seen in the U.S. a lot in the last few years. Arguably, the financial crisis was deepest in those countries that were most oriented towards shareholder value, like the U.S. and Great Britain, much less so in countries where shareholder-owned corporations are less central, like Germany. I have more to say, but I want to thank you at this point and hope to catch up through Skype later in the conference.
Okay, as Jerry was saying, he's hoping to join us later. But let's move swiftly on. Bill Lazonick, if you could give us your 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about why maximizing shareholder value is bad economics. And I think a lot of people have talked about this, but I don't think people have quite hit it on the head. And I hope you agree that I'm hitting it on the head. And also what's needed to replace it. Okay. Well, first of all, there's some data on large corporations, and I'm going to look at the U.S., the land of shareholder value. Large corporations are incredibly important to the economy. This is the last census data that was collected on concentration of corporations. So you can see for corporations 500 employees or over, it's 57% of payrolls and 51% of the labor force. I mean, it's huge. Shareholder value is relatively recent. I took these quote in one of the next slide from Ken Jacobson, who's here, who on Business Roundtable as late as 1981. It was still basically, I mean, shareholders were kind of primary, but it was still a stakeholder view. You know, you had to strike a balance. And that changed over the course of the 80s, but it's important to know that at the beginning of the 80s, shareholder value, no one was really arguing this. It wasn't a public argument. Michael Jensen, there's no doubt that he brought this to the center stage. He came in 1984-85 from the University of Rochester by way of Chicago to Harvard University. I was there at Harvard University at that time. I saw him come there. I'd been in the Harvard Economics Department for quite a long time before that. I saw right away, and I told people at the time, this is trouble. But within a couple of years, he dominated the discussion there. Most Harvard Business School professors did not agree with him at all. Their own experience told them this was all wrong, but there was very little critique. I wrote my first critique of this stuff in 1988. I've been trying to make some headway ever since. Now, in theory, the critical assumption is basically shareholders are the only group of people in the economy who bear risk. And this comes out of the neoclassical economic theory because we're supposed to live in a market economy. So first of all, it's starting from a theory that totally ignores the corporation, totally ignores the sources of productivity, and says everybody gets a market return except shareholders who if the corporation gains, makes profits, they get a gain. If it doesn't, they lose. And it then is assumed, although they have no theory whatsoever about what the risk-bearing function does to generate productivity, so-called long-term growth, they then assume that that makes for a more efficient economy, and therefore you want to get all the money possible in the hands of people who bear risk so they can allocate it. And this then led to Jensen in practice, making this argument of disgorging the free cash flow, so-called free cash flow. And in fact, that is what has been done. And if you don't look at the phenomenon of stock buybacks, and this will be a central thing that I want to talk about, you do not see the triumph of shareholder value. Stock buybacks are also linked in turn to executive pay. Executives, I'll show you some data, but I have a bit here. You can see for 2012, 78% of the pay of the 500 top executives, which was enormous, $24.4 million on average, came from stock-based pay, mostly from stock options, or from restricted stock, which now typically has earning per share requirements. You have to hit targets. So they do the buybacks, they sell they exercise their options, sell their stock, they make lots of money, and I could go through the whole process of how this works in terms of compensation consultants, a whole bunch of things. But in practice, that's what. Okay, here you have the data. We traced about 251 companies back from 2012 to 1981, so it's all the same companies. And you can see around 1997, buybacks surpassing dividends as a mode of compensation. Dividends have not declined. You see that the SEC Rule 10b-18, November 1982, as far as I'm concerned, that is the most important change that has occurred in the shareholder value movement before shareholder value was argued. It was brought in by a guy from Wall Street, John Shadd, who was the head of the Securities Exchange Commission. He had been the first guy in Wall Street to come out for Ronald Reagan, his biggest fundraiser. And as soon as he got into the SEC, he said, this is not a regulatory agency. The purpose of the SEC is to promote the stock market. And basically the SEC has been doing that. The regulatory agency, so-called, has been doing that ever since. So it's not a surprise to me that they didn't catch Bernie Madoff. This is payout ratios. They weren't particularly low at the beginning of the 1980s, but it was all dividends. And they're somewhat higher now. Okay. This is some of the latest data on stock buybacks and how it tends to push up the S&P 500, particularly over the last decade. Okay, these are data. This is put out by the FLCIO. There's a lot of issues about these data. I'll show you some others in a second. This is the ratio of CEO pay to the average worker. It's huge. Even at 40-to-1 back in the early 1980s, that's high by today's standards in Europe. So this is crazy. I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenally crazy. These data are crazy too. The top 500, you can see 100, 500, 1,500, 3,000. Even when you get to the top 3,000, who are measured in the proxy statements, actually there's a lot more because some of the biggest companies have people who are below the top 5 who are paid more than some of the people who are in the 3,000. But the average that you get out of this is 7.4 million, even for that number. The executives, they are the ones who embrace shareholder value. They are the proponents of shareholder value. for years I've been saying this in Europe, shareholder value was not the triumph, at least of institutional investors. Now, the rise of the activists, hedge fund activists, is taking that a lot further. Okay, the consequences, concentration of income at the top, 3 decades long erosion of middle class employment opportunities. I've written a lot about this, I have 3 minutes. Growing gap between productivity, the US economy, and the share of productivity going to real wages. So here are the data, these are from Emmanuel Sayes and Thomas Piketty, and you can see the concentration at the top. And more of it is in what is called salaries, and their data includes stock options, because the IRS doesn't separate that out. I can go into why that's the case. Here is a much more detailed analysis of basically changes that have taken place in the United States in employment relations, closing of plants in the 1980s, the end of career employment with one company in the beginning of the 1990s, beginning with IBM, absolutely fundamental change in the triumph of shareholder value, and then globalization, which has made jobs all the more secure for everybody. Here's the gap between productivity and wages, which was not there post-World War II, which has now grown. Okay, the economic critique of shareholder value. The fundamental assumption that only shareholders take risk is wrong. Taxpayers take risk. So taxpayers are funding almost everything that's in this iPhone. Every technology was originally funded by taxpayers. So we as taxpayers, I'm an American, I want a return. Now the tax system gives us a return, but of course we know what's happened with the tax system. Really under the ideology of shareholder value, you need to give more money to shareholders so they'll take more risk and invest in the economy. They don't, they take money out of the economy. Workers take risk. Workers take risk every day when they don't come and just do the job for the pay, but they're doing the job because there's a future in the company for which they work if they, in fact, exercise that effort. So really the critical issue is not skill, but effort and organizational learning, which results in skill. And also when that's in place, companies invest in the skills of these people and they get the returns through promotions. They were getting that up until the early 1990s in the United States, because that was the norm in companies, that you had a career with one job. That shareholder value ended all that. The irony of shareholder value, maximizing shareholder value, the public shareholders do not invest in companies. Okay, Apple, we all know that case. The only time public investors put any money into Apple was in 1980 when it did its IPO, $97 million. Okay, so now Carl Icahn comes along and wants $150 billion paid out to shareholders. Okay, enough said. The theory, okay, we need a theory of innovative enterprise. So this is what I've been working on, probably even longer than I've been critiquing shareholder value. It's what's missing with economics. You can't just say long run. You have to say what it is that produces productivity in the long run. Or else you have Jensen's critique as management just inefficient. So you have to have a theory about what makes for an innovative enterprise. So there's three fundamental principles. The people who run those enterprises have to have the incentive and ability to confront uncertainty, invest in the future. They don't do that alone. They do it by integrating an organization of people who engage in organizational learning. And those people both have to be motivated and rewarded to do that. And that means that their careers have to be sustained. Maybe not with one corporation, but in general. And thirdly, you have to have financial commitment. Well, stock buybacks are the antithesis, and when you add in dividends to financial commitment. And there's lots and lots of companies that I can go and point out along the way, Motorola, BlackBerry, a whole number of HP, that have done billions and billions of dollars of stock buybacks, and 1 or 2 years later they're taking losses and it's finished. Now, for some of the companies like Apple, Cisco, Microsoft, they can do this for a long time, and they do tens of billions of dollars a year sometime, and they can still go making money because of their entrenched market position. You have to look at individual industries and individual companies to understand really what is going on and what is going to happen in the long run. But it happens in the long run if they keep pursuing the shareholder value investment strategy, what Marion Sullivan and I call the downsize and distribute investment strategy, ultimately kicks in and those corporations are done and they have this bad impact on the economy. Finally, so let's get together and let good economics drive out the bad. This is not just driving out maximizing shareholder value. It's driving out the garbage that is taught to hundreds of millions of people, or let's say millions of people every year, I don't know how many, way too many, every year in undergraduate economics textbooks. And they're textbooks that are put out by people like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman, I think mainly to make money. They have the most ridiculous theory of the firm. They have the theory of the uninnovative firm. Did you know that the theory of the firm that it underlies innovative, perfect competition is a theory that where the firm is very small relative to the size of the market because, I'll just finish this sentence, because people aren't productive. They won't go, they go to work and don't do any work. Look at the textbooks. So look at the old textbooks where they actually justify the theory of the firm. People go to work, they don't do any work, the work remains, the firm remains small, managers don't do anything about it, they can't manage their labor force, and there you get perfect competition. That led to Fama, that led to Jensen. So you have to go back and attack neoclassical economics, the Nobel Prize in neoclassical economics. It's so deeply entrenched, and that's not just an American problem, that's a European problem.
Okay, Beate, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself in 10 minutes?
Sure. My name is Beate. I'm at the Social Science Research Center Berlin in a group called Project Group Modes on Economic Governance. But I'm sitting here, I guess, because I'm one of the editors of a book on the history of neoliberal thought. We worked on the history of neoliberal thinking for a while, and part of this was a project at NYU, where we did a program under the title The Authority of Knowledge in a Global Age, Year 1, the Rule of the Market. And this was organized by Tim Mitchell. And I applied at the time with my project on organized neoliberals. I think the discussion so far, in fact, kind of nicely shows and demonstrates how we as academics on the one hand believe in our sort of like competency in our field, in our compartmentalized area of disciplinary knowledge, and then we are confronted with sort of like powerful ideas coming from elsewhere, and now we have to again make sense of why aren't we asked as legal experts from the firm, where does this powerful idea of new competency on the purpose of the corporation as defined by principal agent theory come from? And I think this is one of the problems that we have to think in different ways of the academic system, so like the academic discourse and the links between knowledge and politics and also knowledge and economics. Now, with all due respect, Professor Lazonick, I think we have to somehow get our neoclassical economics right. It is not due to neoclassical economics. There's certainly a powerful background in all this in neoclassical economics, but as much as Keynes built on neoclassical economics and sort of like rejected notions of equilibrium and sort of like labor markets are simple markets and developed a whole new approach, still carrying on a lot of neoclassical economics. And I guess most of us would easily say that Keynes and Keynes' approaches to the corporation are sort of like the better sort of like direction. Now the neoclassical economics, in a way, has first of all to say nothing about firms. In fact, it's a story about markets clearing almost by themselves, sellers, buyers, sort of like interacting at prices that serve sort of like an equilibrium. That was, in fact, sort of like a model thinking of the economy, and there was no place, in a way, for firms. And this was the reason, in fact, why we have to actually be grateful to one of the leading advocates of later positions of shareholder value, Gerald, for basically introducing the firm to economic reason. And this was basically acknowledging, like Keynes acknowledged, there's no normal functioning labor markets. It was also acknowledging there is no such thing as a neoclassical ideal equilibrium market. There is disequilibrium, and there are things that we cannot explain by market theory alone. There are firms, and Coase called them hierarchies. His way of thinking about firms is rather reductionist and in a way very much in line with previous model type modeling of economics as in neoclassical economics, because he had indeed one explanation: transaction costs. Internal transaction costs within firms and external transaction costs, which lead to create islands of non-markets. And that's firms in his understanding. And basically his or economists' understanding of the legal system is also very simplified and not in line with what legal experts, of course, know and think. It's basically a very simple deduction. If there's then a hierarchy and it's based on relationship between people who create these hierarchies, then they call these contractual relations. And basically this is the beginning of what then, afterwards, was turned into a much, much more powerful. I mean, for example, Coase, we can also still be grateful for, first of all, turning our attention to microeconomics rather than just macroeconomics. Secondly, he also introduced the idea of the inevitability and the necessity of institutions in economics. So basically, he is a very powerful economist introducing much of what other people have long talked about, 1873, understanding of the firm, organization theory, legal history, and so on and so forth. But in modern economics, Coase brought back the notion of the firm and the notion of institutions. Now, the way he thought about firms and institutions are very, very problematic and very simplistic and very sort of like based on rational choice models, and so we have to engage basically at this level. Those people who basically completely reject neoclassical economics, Baumol and Williamson, who basically founded modern contract theory in economics and rational choice-based economic neo-institutionalism, they are basically completely in line with you. Neoclassical economics is nonsense, doesn't work. You have to think differently, and they propose the best way to think of it is starting on the principal agent model, which is again sort of like isolating, modelizing basically instances, no matter if the firm is in Germany or the firm is in the United States or the firm is anywhere else. It basically consists of people who invest money, shareholders, possibly with all limitations discussed, and then managers, and then of course also workers, but they are not important. I mean, what really principal agent theory does is reconceptualize the idea of the firm as an ideal sort of like problem from the perspective of capital owners and their problems with the firm. And that's basically the way they kind of look at the firm and the reasons and the rationale of the firm, no matter where. They are not concerned with the sort of like the differences which we know from different legal systems and from different social systems and so on and so forth, different industrial relation systems. They are having a powerful answer to questions, sort of like how, what is a firm from the perspective of those who invest money? That's a simple question, and they try to address. And then come what they call positive analysis. They look at this problem in Germany and say, oh, powerful industrial relations actors, trade unions, and they sort of like take a big share of the profits of the firm. So then there's a problem from the perspective of the person who invests money. And then sort of like declinating this down comes basically the idea, so what should we do on the basis of this perspective, on this sort of like starting point of the analysis to improve the position of the investors? And that's basically, okay, let's move away from a German co-determination system. Let's try to limit the role of workers' involvement. Let's try to limit all kinds of other involvement in life. Let's try to change the legal system. And that's where your legal scholars come in. And of course, they're also not just in economics. This perspective, rational choice-based reasoning, has entered the legal discipline very powerful. Henry Mannen was, of course, the key person who has started the law and economics movement and who has basically started to address, give a completely new perspective on how to think of the relationship between law and economics here in the United States, and then, of course, this has been expanded far and wide. I think this is basically one of the key reasons. We need to see that it's not just disciplinary, it's transdisciplinary. We have basic ways of reasoning, and this is rational choice based with reasoning, which is actually entering other disciplines, other spheres, and is powerful in terms of being able to address certain questions, to convince certain powerful constituencies, namely shareholders, obviously, and capital owners, and to actually build institutions. And this is basically, Henry Mannen couldn't have done it alone. Yes, he was powerful in developing the discipline, but he was backed by a lot of money from the Olin Foundation. So many of the ideas are not necessarily powerful because they are right or wrong, but of course, because of the relations they have in the real world. And academics sometimes are a bit focused on just the world of ideas, I guess. Well, if firms are primarily conceived then as problems of shareholders, then of course, because of all these reasons that are analyzed in these principles, then of course firms and their principals, namely these investors, they need specific and overriding rights as to sort of like the rights of managers or the claims of workers and so on and so forth. And that leads to basically a notion of you need constitutional rights for this specific group of sort of like investors. And all the other claims are subordinated to this group. And how do you manage this in a political system? If you have democracy, you have changing rights, changing fortunes of political parties. You have to actually constitutionalize this. So you have to change the system so as to workers, managers, other people cannot interfere to a certain extent with the claims of the shareholders. And of course, the resulting best practice that comes out of this is a disenfranchising of non-owners. It's basically the idea, the revival of old ideas of self-regulation. It's the benefits of unilateral control of investors. It's basically the emphasis on deregulation and the free movement. Short-termism obviously is necessary in order to have not countervailing forces. It's basically unprecedented control of shareholders in corporate affairs. Basically, it's interesting that it's a revival of laissez-faire, market self-regulation notions on these sort of like new modernized terms. However, there's a paradox, because at the same time, you need to control the state. So we have a hidden state agenda to basically secure and constitutionalize these ideas. And of course, the result is that we have the shareholder in this imagery as basically a holy cow, something that exists, that is sort of like not to be touched, and that is free to graze and move wherever. I leave the consequences out, but this is, I think, a necessary point in reconstructing the sort of like rise and the power of the ideas of shareholder value and its political implications.
Okay, did you want to? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Beate Sjafjell. I'm a professor in law at the Faculty of Law in the University of Oslo. I come here today as the head of the international research project, the Sustainable Companies Project, which has as its aim to show how to find out how we better can integrate environmental concerns into the decision-making of companies. So our focus has been on the environmental dimension, with climate change as a case in point. But a lot of what we have done and what I will present today is also directly relevant to social issues and indeed even to the financial issues. This is one small contribution to the jigsaw puzzle of sustainability that we need to get into place quickly. I would like to start by thanking Frank and Cardiff Business School for this wonderful and very important initiative, and to Mr. Richard Howard for hosting this conference. Now, the company is an ingenious invention. It is perhaps the most important legal invention for business, for our economy, since Roman law gave us the contract. It has the capacity of channeling capital to entrepreneurs, which they could not get by going to the local bank. And as a starting point, it has the capacity and has created value not only for investors, but also for people who have been given jobs and for society at large. At the same time, we know that business as usual is not an alternative. To just mention one of the 9 planetary boundaries that Rockström and his co-authors have identified through their seminal article on planetary boundaries. We know from the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change that business as usual is a very certain path to a very uncertain future, where the entire basis for our societies, for our economies and our societies at large are at stake. We also know that the voluntary shift towards more sustainable companies is going too slowly, and there are lots of reasons for that, which time doesn't allow me to go into. But we also know that the competitive advantage today is for the same reasons given to the unsustainable companies. And as Andrew explained very well earlier today, we have in our Sustainable Companies project, as has also been done by other distinguished colleagues here today, identified the shareholder primacy drive as the social norm, not shareholder value as the legal norm, for example, in the UK Companies Act, but the broader dominating shareholder primacy drive as a social norm as the main barrier to more sustainable companies. And the social norm has developed within the broad scope of latitude that company law gives to boards. As Andrew said, the company law is ripe with possibilities for the necessary change. But company law has allowed the shareholder primacy drive to develop because of what company law, generally speaking, across jurisdictions, doesn't explicitly say. Company law doesn't say anything about why we have companies. It doesn't say anything about society's purpose with companies. It regulates, for historical reasons, the relationship between shareholders and companies, and this is a part of the reason that this misunderstanding that companies are only vehicles for shareholder profit has been allowed to develop. And that is also, the blame for this also rests with some of many of my company law colleagues who haven't gone deep into the sources of law and looked at what is company law about. They've looked at just what do the Companies Acts regulate, and they have from that drawn the conclusion that companies are about shareholder profit. So what company law doesn't say explicitly is a part of the reason for the status that we have today. And what we need to do is we need to move beyond CSR as it has been understood and advocated by many business lobbyists as being about what companies do on a purely voluntary basis. We need to move beyond the current mainstream corporate governance focus with its narrow focus on the relationship between the shareholders and the board. And we need to achieve a better integration between the different areas of law instead of them working a counter-purpose. We need to enable the good companies. There are good companies out there that are struggling because the competitive advantage lies with the unsustainable companies. And the barrier that we have identified and the reasons that this barrier has been allowed to develop, namely what company law, what the Companies Acts across jurisdictions do not explicitly say anything about, indicates also the direction of reform. Legal reform is necessary. It's a necessary contribution to mitigate the narrow short-term effect of shareholder primacy. And we need to redefine company purpose and the role and the duties of the board. And this has to include a duty to conduct life cycle analysis of the core business of the company, to internalize both the environmental and social effects of the business. We need to encapsulate the ongoing discussion of due diligence, and that has to not only relate to the company as a legal entity, but also to the group, to these multinational enterprises, and to supply chains. And this has to be backed up by integrated reporting with proper auditing. And this is, of course, just a part of a necessary legal reform. We need legal reform, we need a new way of thinking also with financial market rules, public procurement, state aid, and as was mentioned in the previous discussion, also the tax rules. Because we could have reform that could give the good companies a competitive advantage and enable the long-term prosperity of the small and medium-sized enterprises that are the backbone of our economies, as well as the multinational enterprises. Now, if we look at the status today, there is a shift already on the EU level. There have been some very interesting things happening over the last years. We see a certain convergence tendency between corporate governance and CSR. There was a redefinition of CSR on the EU level in 2011, which is very important. Short-termism has been recognized as problematic, and there is a focus on risk management that includes also what is so eloquently phrased as non-financial issues. But we still have shareholder primacy as the main drive. We still do not have any clear duties to integrate these other issues. And in spite of all the good efforts by the European Parliament and by Mr. Richard Howard, it looks like we will not have sufficient rules on non-financial reporting. Okay. Now, EU law provides a legal basis for the necessary change. The EU could take the lead globally by taking its own treaty rules seriously, by integrating environmental protection and social issues into all areas properly, and ensuring the competitiveness of sustainable European companies and showing the world what that is. The Sustainable Companies Project has been running for 4 years and is, as a Research Council finance project, at its end now. But we have a number of follow-up events, including a workshop in May, where we will hammer out the details of our reform proposal for the EU level. And we want to present this in Brussels later this year. I'm very interested in continuing this discourse with all of you wonderful people here. So if you want to stay in touch, please contact me. And we also have a new research project planned from this fall. Thank you very much.